Professor Claudia Aradau and dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to another nice webinar on security practices in the digital age. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. To talk on a very interesting topic of today, we have invited Professor Claudia Aradau. Professor Aradau, we are very thankful for your valuable time. Professor Claudia Aradau is a professor of international politics in the Department of War Studies. She has spent a decade as associate editor and editor of Security Dialogue. Her research has developed a critical political analysis of security practices. Among her publications are Politics of Catastrophe, Genealogies of Unknown and Critical Security Methods, New Framework for Analysis. Her journal article has proposed novel research agenda in critical security studies and international relations around democracy and security, risk and multilateralism, and epistemic politics. She is on the editorial collective of Radical Philosophy and on the editorial board of International Politics, Sociology, and Security Dialogue. She has been chair of Science, Technology, and Art section of the International Studies Association. Professor Aradau is Principal Investigator of the European Research Council Consolidator, Grand Security Flows, Enacting Border Security in the Digital Age, Political World of Data Flow and Frictions, and of the Open Research Area Funded Grant GUARDINT Oversight and Intelligence Network, whose guards and guardians. She is currently finalizing a book with Tobias Blanke on algorithmic reasoning, the new government of self and others. Dr. Aradau, please make your initial remark in 30 to 40 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. We request all our participants to drop their question in the chat box or on the Facebook Live. You may also send it by WhatsApp or tweet us at our Twitter handle. Dr. Aradau, the floor is yours. Over to you, madam.
Okay, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at NICE. Today, it is a pleasure to be here, even though only in this virtual form, to speak about a quite wide-ranging topic on security practices in the digital age. I'm going to try again to share my screen and hope this works, and I hope you can let me know if you can see it. Yeah. Let's from start. Okay. So given the broad topic, I would like to start by making a few remarks on how I approach this question of security practices, why security practices in the digital age. So the perspective I developed, as mentioned earlier, is inspired by an interdisciplinary approach called critical security studies. So critical security studies has developed in international relations, but is now an interdisciplinary field that has intersections with anthropology, sociology, also science and technology studies. And I think what is important about the approach, the way security is understood, is that security is not an object, and it's not a property, it's not a possession, not something we have or we don't have, right? But security is a practice. It's something that a lot of actors are doing, right, as part of their professions, through their everyday kind of practices, and we can think, you know, whether we think of the military or border professionals, as in my current research. And it requires particular forms of knowledge, but also particular technical and methodological devices, right? So we think again about a lot of the technologies, also today digital technologies, in relation to security. And if we think, for instance, of the microscope, right? The microscope makes visible as an instrument, as a technical, but also in relation to methodology, it makes visible different things, and therefore one might be perceived as dangerous, the kind of measures to be taken and so on, is changed depending on the technology. What is, again, I think, important to analysis in critical security studies is not just this element that, what counts in the practices of security depend on different cultural practices as well, on these modes of knowledge like epistemologies and instrumentation, but also that fundamentally security practices are about discourses of danger and representations of the enemy, of risky or suspicious others, in a context in which oppositional violence towards another exists. And this is a quote from Keith Krause and Michael Williams quite a long time ago now, in a collective book on introducing some of the key elements of critical security studies. Another aspect that I think is very relevant to these questions of a digital age is the transformation or the attention in critical security studies of the transformation of security, right? So if security is a practice, if it is done by very different actors, it is not always the same. And one of these transformations that scholars have traced is between kind of reactive securities to what has been called proactive or anticipatory forms of security. So security that is increasingly turned towards the future, right? Towards what kind of threats might emerge in the future, towards what kind of risks we might encounter in the future, rather than what is here at the moment in terms of imminent threat. So this turn towards anticipatory security means that security professionals are not concerned just with immediate enemies and extraordinary measures to be taken, but with dangers that might emerge in the near or not so near future. This anticipatory orientation has been translated, for instance, through the languages of risks or uncertainty and associated practices of prevention, preemption, preparedness, or resilience. So the concept of risk has shifted the analytical focus from securitizing utterances, securitizing speech acts about imminent threat and exceptional measures, to the technologies and the strategies by means of which the future is produced as calculable and as governable, right? So it's about kind of doing something about the future, bringing the future in a sort of extended present. An unknown future is tamed, for instance, through the production of statistical knowledge about populations and population groups, and also preventive interventions, right? To act before a threat materializes or a risk materializes. My colleague here at King's College London, Didier Bigot, has analyzed how risk emerges in the practices of what he has called managers of unease, the police, the intelligence services, the military, or private security agencies, right, who use the authority of statistics and statistical knowledge to classify and prioritize risks. To give you an example, right, from my current work around borders, the EU Border Agency, which is also called Frontex, publishes quarterly risk analysis reports based on numbers of migrant nationalities, right, by calculating the risks in relation to these different profiles, right, so that they can deal with risk profiles and trends. So in my own work, my own earlier work on migration, borders, and human trafficking, I have shown how risk is an important logic of governing, right, of these social and political issues. But moving beyond risk, scholars have also showed that there is radical uncertainty that actually challenges, right, this logic of risk and preventive interventions. And there are different techniques and mode of knowledge which I will refer to here as preemptive. Right? So kind of preemption is another logic that cannot be reduced to that of risk and prevention, but it challenges the limits of risk and prevention. And this has particularly emerged around, or in the literature and critical security studies, there has been particular attention to, after 2001, to the war on terror, where for security professionals, and intelligence agencies, the risk models and statistical knowledge were not enough. Right? Partly because the challenge came from what the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, infamously called unknown unknowns. And I'll come back later to this kind of matrix of known and unknowns, because I think it's quite relevant for how we think about the digital age as well, and security in the digital age. So the things we do not know, we do not know. This radical uncertainty in the future. So in the face of this future unknown unknowns, the technologies of governing have been changing. As again, to quote from Louise A. Moore, who has written widely on preemption, these techniques rely on preemptive decisions that do not calculate probability on the basis of past evidence as statistics, but rather on the horizon of what might happen in the future, right? So it's this kind of turn towards uncertainty, towards possibility, and what might happen in the future, rather than kind of what happened in the past. And then here we have a range of different techniques, from scenario planning, foresight, emergency exercises, resilience training, right? This idea that the future and the future uncertainty can be made governable. More recently, I would argue, with digital technologies, we have seen another slight transformation of prediction, right? Also in relation to this question of the unknowns that the future might harbor, but this time kind of mobilizing digital technologies, particularly in the form of big data and machine learning algorithms, to actually somehow pierce this uncertainty of the future. From connecting the dots to finding the needle in a haystack, security professionals have increasingly adopted the language and methods of computing, right, for these purposes, what is often called prediction. In so doing, they have taken inspiration from big data applications in the corporate, in the commercial world, and have developed practices of working with big data and algorithms. So computer scientists and practitioners concur in emphasizing this predictive logic of big data more generally, and not just the purposes of security. And you can see here this brief kind of, I think it captures what's at stake, that prediction is the hallmark of big data. Prediction here is particularly understood as the possibility of connecting, as in connecting the dots, connecting a lot of data points, but with the aim of also finding the needle in the haystack, which has become the metaphor of this unknown unknowns, right? So it's kind of closely connected to preemption, but also slightly different. In the rest of today's talk, I would like to argue that this turn towards the digital, and particularly machine learning algorithms, has changed the representation of the enemy, has changed the knowledge, how knowledge is produced by the enemy, and about who comes to count as a security threat. So to do so, I would like to first kind of have a broad brush analysis of how the figure of the enemy has been dealt with in philosophical and political thought, but also in critical security studies, to then trace this transformation in the digital age that security practices entail for the figure of the enemy. So as you can see here in this quote from Achille Mbembe, the question, right, of identifying the enemy with some certainty remains a key question about knowledge, right, about how we do it, about the technologies that are available. Now, in analysis of who is the enemy and how the figure of the enemy emerges, there are kind of several important points of transformation. So one important point is that of modernity, and this idea that there is an enemy of all humanity that modernity kind of starts representing. And we can see in historical analysis that this distinction between friend and enemy, or again, people who kind of remember or draw on the work of Carl Schmitt as the political separation of hostes and inimicus, have been analyzed in these terms of historical continuity and discontinuity. So for instance, in cultural studies, the figure of the enemy as the enemy of all humankind is cast as the archetypical pirate figure, right? So that the international terrorist, for instance, becomes recognizable as a quasi-pirate. This I cited here from Sonia Schilling's historical work and on fictions of legitimate violence. Yet the figure of the enemy emerges not just through cultural practices, but as I was arguing in relation to critical security studies, through different practices of professionals like military professionals, intelligence professionals as well, but also computing professionals and technological devices that also very historical. Critical scholars have explored these multiform figures of the enemy, right? While also tending to continuities in how the enemy has been represented and therefore responded to. Historian Reinhard Koselleck, for instance, has shown that modernity brought, and I quote from him, a radicalization of concepts of the enemy through the language of the inhuman and subhuman. According to him, this language of representing the enemy would have been inconceivable before, right? So there's not that creates an important hierarchy, right, of inhumanity and subhumanity, which kind of erases an equal kind of plane of friend and enemy. More recently, Achille Member, whom I cited earlier, has analyzed a sort of exacerbation of the figure of the enemy today, to the extent that he comes to diagnose the present as a society of enmity. In international relations, the transformation of the figure of the enemy has been particularly analyzed in relation to the war on terror after 2001. Different scholars have explored how and why the enemy is produced as more fluid, elusive, and abstract. In drawing attention to how the category of the universal adversary was invented in US Homeland Security, Mark Neocleous shows how the universal adversary mobilizes many adjectives of invisible, faceless, elusive, or abstract, thus leaving the category of the enemy open to endless modification. Another international relations scholar, Christian Olsen, argues by contrast that contemporary wars evince an avoidance or even absence of officially declared enemies. So many substitutes, right? Many other euphemisms are used to avoid explicit reference to an enemy, for instance, in the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. So Olson's insights are particularly relevant as he focuses on military and political discourses, which have historically been most authoritative in articulating figures of the enemy. In her analysis of the legal languages this time of how civilians and the distinction between civilian and combatant is used, Christian Wilke points out that combatant has again been replaced by a multitude of terms: unlawful combatant, illegal enemy, aliens, insurgents, irregular forces, militants, or warlords, which according to her enable the modification and withdrawal of legal protections that are attached to the standard categories of the laws of war. So in our forthcoming book that Pramod kindly mentioned, Algorithmic Reason, the New Government as Self and Other, Tobias Blanke and I propose the concept of the enemy multiple to account for the coexistence, contestation, and coordination of these multiple figures of the enemy across social and political practices. So the enemy multiple does not mean simply that the enemy is more fluid or evanescent, but it captures this heterogeneous production of enemies in different kind of social worlds by different professionals, right? And aims to trace these circulations and reconfigurations of who the enemy is, right? So the enemy multiple orients us to how these different worlds produce particular figures of the enemy. So again, to go back to Didier Bigo's work, he has shown that different categories of security professionals enact different types of dangerous or risky others. So for instance, if the military could stay focused on the enemy, this is not the case of border professionals, or the police would be more focused on the figure of the criminal, right? So we have the kind of different productions, right, in different professional spheres. A textbook introduction, again, to Homeland Security for emergency management professionals reiterates the view that contemporary terrorism is diametrically opposed to the identifiable and known enemy of traditional conflicts. So according to this textbook, terrorists today are often not distinguishable from normal citizens, as they have foregone all insignia of distinction, uniforms like contain battlefield or intent to attack. Therefore, what distinguishes potential terrorists can only be captured at the level of minuscule detail. The potential terrorist cannot be located visually or cannot be identified simply visually. Right? So if we think again of this question of the enemy, particularly in relation to drones and drone warfare and targeting, a lot of the analysis has focused on these questions of visibility, right? How does the person who's targeted, how do they become visible? But there is another important question in relation to drones, for instance, which need to be also analyzed as data collection and processing machines, right? There are also a control center for all this data collection. So data is collected, processed, and reprocessed, so that minute details that emerge through this data might render someone as, potential target, as potentially dangerous. And we can discuss about what exactly that entails. I will also try to explain some of these elements later on. So I would suggest that one key distinction that is important in relation to the digital age is exactly the amount of digital data that can be collected, stored, and processed algorithmically. So then how is the dangerous other, the enemy, or the suspicious other detected in these masses of data? So based on the work that Tobias Blanke and I have done, I would like to propose today that the enemy is, or the figure of the dangerous other is produced today as an anomaly rather than the enemy, right? So that means that it is not a true or hidden enemy that we find in the data, but a different kind of figure of a dangerous other. And to do so, I would like to actually go back a few years and turn to the documents that were made public by Edward Snowden back in 2013, but also by investigative journalists since then, that actually allow us to trace some of the logics that intelligence agencies like the National Security Agency and the GCHQ in the UK are deployed in dealing with these masses of data, right? And in dealing with this question of unknown unknowns and the potentially dangerous other. And what we get in this document, and I will want to kind of relay this back to the Rumsfeld matrix, which I added here just as a reminder for us that there are 4 categories. In fact, Rumsfeld only used 3 of them. The known unknowns, which are about this immediate threat, the unknown knowns, which are about the kind of statistical knowledge, the things that we can make calculable about risk, and the unknown unknowns, which kind of remains still the main kind of issue that digital technologies and particularly data is supposed to kind of give access to. He never talked about the known unknowns, but then we can turn to this later on. So I want to suggest that actually, if we look quite closely at these documents from 2013 and later on, we can see that anomaly detection is a sort of holy grail for intelligence agencies in particular. So the UK government, for instance, argues that access to bulk data, that's also this masses of digital data, allows the intelligence agency to search for traces of activity by individuals who might not yet be known to the agencies, or to identify potential threats and patterns of activity that might indicate national security concern. Right? So the role of anomaly detection and its importance for intelligence agencies in this case has been reinforced by a series of reports, by a series of inquiries in the UK. And I think it is important to connect here both these disclosures, right, these revelations and the documents that we have access to now through the Snowden archive, with the public documents that reiterate some of this importance of anomaly detection, with the work in computer science about security and anomaly detection. Right? So computer scientists themselves reinforce the centrality of anomaly detection, declaring it, and I quote from computer science text, a vital text with numerous high-impact applications in areas such as security, finance, healthcare, and law enforcement. So one of the documents disclosed by Snowden, which you can see in the slide, maps the current technological capabilities developed by the NSA and the GCHQ, right? And the matrix that you see is literally a replica of Rumsfeld's matrix, but in a very different document. So there are all variations of these questions of known unknown target and known unknown query. So the GCHQ matrix, this one in particular, starts from the case of known knowns, where both the target and the query are known. For instance, has X been in regular contact with Y? So the remainder of the matrix gradually inserts unknowns, right, into the practice of intelligence and the use of data. And for the purposes of today and this question of unknown unknowns, it is the fourth case in the matrix that is most important, because it combines an unknown target with an unknown query. And this is the case that's associated with anomaly detection, right? So the document points out that the key question, the holy grail, is to find these anomalies and to find them by using digital data. So anomaly detection, therefore, names more specifically the promise that the digital data is offering today for security. And I will show later on, I don't know where the time is going fast, but that anomaly detection also comes with a whole series of issues, but it promises, right, to capture unidentified threats and do that at scale. So for security professionals, one of the greatest promises of big data is exactly that it appears to offer the possibility of finding suspicious activity by detecting anomalies or outliers. Another report that was disclosed a few years later, back in 2016 by Snowden, acknowledges that outliers, for instance, low volume telephone numbers or small connected components, are exactly what signal intelligence and intelligence professionals are interested in. In an earlier document detailing the capabilities of X-key score, the question of how do I find a cell of terrorists that has no connection to known strong selectors, a selector like an email address or a phone number, is answered by look for anomalous events. Anomalous events are then illustrated by a series of examples. Someone whose language is out of place for the region they're in, someone who is using encryption, someone searching the web for suspicious stuff. So the language of security professionals, borrowing from that of computer science, moves through this question of anomaly and defines it as that which is out of place or in some way unusual. So if we turn from this language and this document of security professionals back to computer science, we find anomaly detection as a key technique of machine learning. Right? And today, it's kind of machine learning is often equated with artificial intelligence, but this is another discussion. So one such computer science article notes that knowing what stands out in the data is often at least, or even more important and interesting than learning about the general structure. So anomaly detection is the result of developing algorithmic techniques to look for this unusual, out of place, non-conformant behavior, which is different from what appear to be irregularities in the data. Right? So anomalies are metaphorically defined here, right? There isn't a clear kind of definition of what an anomaly is. So they could be abnormalities, what is discordant, what is deviant, what is in some way, again, out of place. Another article defines it even more metaphorically as the odd ones in the midst of data. But I think what I would like to highlight as kind of a result of this intersection between security knowledge and computer science knowledge is that anomaly detection has become quite central to the effort of security agencies and the intelligence agency, where anomaly detection by using this digital data is about the struggle to distinguish anomalies, right, from whatever noise might be in the data, and kind of bring security or make security as being about these very minuscule, very minute, fine distinctions. And here, terrorism, cybersecurity, online fraud, and critical infrastructure protection emerge as key areas for the application of anomaly detection techniques. Now, I want to turn to, if this promise that digital data entails, and particularly the promises of anomaly detection for intelligence agency entail, might sound quite attractive. I actually want to turn to some of the issues that this raises, right? The kind of issues in terms of knowledge, but also political issues. So in March 2017, two journalists, Abdul Karim and Ahmad Zaidan, filed a lawsuit in the US against the Trump administration for having been wrongly put on the US kill list and targeted by drone strikes. They argued that their being targeted was the result of arbitrary action and asked for the possibility of challenging their inclusion on the kill list. Ahmad Zaidan, you can see here from one of the, again, a document from the Snowden archive, was a known figure to the media, right, as the Snowden documents had shown that he had been singled out as a person of interest for the NSA. So the NSA's infamously named Skynet application had been the object of much public discussion and controversy as it identified innocent people as anomalies and potential targets of drone strikes. So documents again made public by The Intercept this time showed that NSA analysts were interested in finding similar behavior based on analysis of GSM metadata collected from the surveillance of mobile phone networks in Pakistan. So Skynet used travel patterns based on mobile phone usage patterns, right, such as excessive SIM and handset swapping. And it relied on cloud behavior analytics based on complex combinations of geospatial, geotemporal, pattern of life, and travel analytics to identify patterns of suspect activity. It built on behavior patterns generated from previous targets metadata to then derive insights about unusual kind of patterns and behaviors, right? So according to these documents, Ahmed Zaidan had been identified as a courier for Al-Qaeda and was potentially selected as a US target. The NGO Reprieve, who supported this lawsuit, argued that this identification puts Zaidan at risk of drone attacks, and it endangers journalists whose reporting activities might lead to them being targeted as potential terrorists. Right? So it was through the use of data, through the use of all this mobile phone data, travel and behavior analytics, that Zaidan was all of a sudden cast as a suspect terrorist, being simultaneously a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda courier, while also being a journalist. But this tension was never discussed, right? So I think what is important here is to in terms of what is transformed, is to understand that the production of anomalies, right, through all this data, departs from previous techniques, right, previous statistics techniques, but also from the ways in which network analysis has been used by intelligence agencies, right? So for security and intelligence professionals, social networks have long played a role in discovering the networks of known extremists and identifying their previously unknown contacts. And this technique was one of, as you can see here, of connecting or linking, right? Proceeding from the known to the unknown, and thus producing, again to use the language in Ramsberg's matrix, known unknowns. So for instance, when earlier documents by the GCHQ, networks are so useful, as contact chaining is called the single most common method used for target discovery, starting from a seed selector by looking at the people whom the seed communicates with and the people they in turn communicate with. The analyst begins a painstaking process of assembling information about the terrorist cell or network. I mean, there were lots of problems with this type of contacting, because simply assuming or kind of that there are links kind of was supposed to tell us something about the content of those links, right? So speaking with somebody kind of meant that you know there might have been a kind of joint undertaking in some way. But this, you know, there's problems of, you know, network connecting, linking in networks are actually intensified with digital data, and particularly digital data that is algorithmically processed. Because anomaly detection recasts this relation between known and unknowns, and they're actually working with this kind of multiple unknowns. So again, the PowerPoint disclosed by Snowden in the case of Ahmed Zaidan actually shows us that this anomaly detection relies on these calculations of actually distances, right? This representation of a multitude of data where my own data and what I count as suspicion depends on the representation of all your data in a space, right? So all this phone data is required from Pakistan in order to be able to find an anomaly. So it's only with a massive volume of data that anomaly detection can find, or techniques of anomaly detection can find these very small details that are somehow discordant, unusual, or out of place. So in the figure that you can see here, there is a social network that combines travel behavior and pattern of life that kind of makes it possible for Zaidan to emerge as an anomaly, right? And this is particularly by, you know, kind of locating a small graph that somehow, as you can see, diverge from kind of the majority of the data points and the majority of the graph. So there are a lot, you know, and I list a couple of issues. There are a lot of issues, but there are a couple of issues that I want to highlight. That first, here, questions of identity, of who you are, and behavior are neither aligned, so you are behaving in kind of relation to who you are, and there's some kind of, consistency, nor are they contradictory. So if you behave some completely different, maybe there's something that needs to be dealt with, right? But tensions can simply be coexistent, right? Because that's simply drawn out from this network analysis. So as widely publicized in the media, Zaidan was actually the Al Jazeera bureau chief in Pakistan. However, this tension, right, of identity and this type of behavior were never discussed. And anomaly detection didn't seem to require tackling this contradiction, right, between these different findings about Ahmed Zaidan. So what is important here is that on the one hand, anomaly detection requires this massive amount of data that have to be drawn actually from different parts of the world in order to produce, right, these multiple anomalies. But also these anomalies kind of do not require, the production of these anomalies do not require substantive kind of analysis of either identity or behavior, or kind of some way of dealing with the contradictions that might emerge. And often it is very small details, right? Very small details about travel patterns that will kind of turn someone into an anomaly and therefore, you know, a potential target. So if if I've managed to convince you that we have shifted to this figure of the anomaly, and what we are dealing with in the digital age is a lot of the security practices is the search of anomalies, but the search of anomalies actually opens up to a lot of people who might kind of be targeted as anomalies simply on these tiny differences. What are the wider implications that we need to think of? Right. So I want to kind of close with a few broader implications, and I realize it's been almost 40 minutes, so I will just take a few minutes to actually close, to try to think about these transformations and what they entail more broadly for international politics, but also for analysis in international relations. So firstly, as you will have seen, there are a lot of different vocabularies that are used now by security professionals. Very recently, the GCHQ in the UK has published a document on using artificial intelligence, right? So again, where they describe the different forms of machine learning, the different forms of artificial intelligence and how they can be used. And I think political scientists and international relations scholars cannot avoid engaging and understanding these concepts, right? Cannot avoid actually understanding what anomaly detection means and what it means when it is used, right? In kind of relation to ongoing conflict, on targeting, in relation to, potentially even borders and border security and so on. There is a second element here, which I haven't really discussed, but I want to just kind of draw attention to at the end, that these techniques that are used in computer science and are taken up by security professionals are also techniques that are used in marketing, that are used by the company. So there are techniques that we are actually engaging with on a daily basis. And we can think also our discussion today, or kind of my presentation here, is kind of held on different digital platforms, and we produce a lot of data, not just this direct data, but metadata, so data about data, the time that we all might be spending on it, who is here, right? So there's a whole network that can be produced in terms of this link, who is doing what else, clicking on other pages, for instance, right? So there's all this kind of surveillance around our interactions that can produce a lot of data that can be used by companies such as Facebook or Zoom, but can be used, right, in a whole lot of other areas. And there's kind of increasing research on kind of sale of data and data brokers, but also I think we need to look more closely at how this data is actually used by the purposes of surveillance and the effects that it has. Now, secondly, I think in international relations, we have studied, state and non-state actors, civil society actors, and so on. And I think it is important today to study these relations as digital, is informed by the collection, storage, and extraction of data. Right. So this is what is often referred to as datified relations, right? So the production of data that is computationally usable. So rather than starting with state, non-state, private, public, domestic, international, it is important to think about what kind of human data machine relations might be at stake, right, in these forms of interactions, whether it's about war, whether it's about humanitarian action, whether it's about borders, or whether it's about environmental issues. Finally, given that big tech companies have the infrastructures and computational power to run machine learning algorithms on different types of data, security actors are increasingly reliant on these companies and their infrastructures. In a datified world, all security practices, I would argue, tend to become private security practices, right? However, these effects are unequally felt across the world. For instance, our security actors in the global north have access to data and resources to access infrastructures and expertise for its processing. Big data and the use of algorithms are not limited to countries in the global north. But I think it is important to try to understand how these practices and the use of big data in the global north actually relies on the extraction of data from the global south, as we have seen in the case of Ahmad Zaidan, the extraction of data, in the case of Pakistan. But again, we see the increased use of big data in the global south, whether it's for policing, again, interventions, all sorts of governmental interventions that have, have something to do with problems of border governance, environmental governance, humanitarian crisis governance, and so on. I will stop here, and I hope I have outlined quite a wide area of research, but also something quite specific about how political scientists and international relations actually need to engage much more with this kind of scientific languages, these languages that come from computer science, but also the practices of big tech companies and practices of corporations in using and dealing with big data, and machine learning practices that we don't think about or use them in our everyday life, but can have quite just significant political consequences, but life and death consequences. Thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Professor Claudia Aradau. Thank you very much for the wonderful discussion. It was really interesting discussion, and we learned a lot. Once again, thank you for your time. We have received lots of questions, and we hardly have 15 to 20 minutes. So let me move to the questions that we have received so far. The first question is, it's a technical question. How can we avoid ransomware attacks?
So this is a very complex question. And I think a lot of the ransomware attacks, so for instance, again, I'm going to give an example from the UK, right, and the NHS. What was really interesting about this was that the NHS was using outdated systems, right? So systems where they have not installed security patches. But again, this is a very specific question. So I think some of these issues and kind of thinking about the different kind of security, the kind of security elements of the different software and the different systems that are used across agencies and so on. I think it's a really important issue, right? So there's a question that I haven't researched it personally, so I'm kind of giving you an answer here more in terms of a kind of citizen who's following these debates rather than an expert in ransomware. But I think these questions of that there was a problem of kind of the technology, a problem of investment and so on are important questions in relation to the companies. There's another question that's related to the systems that are used. I think more generally, there's an ongoing debate that is now kind of pursued by governments also in relation to security, which is around questions of encryption and kind of opening, encryption kind of being a limit on the capacities of again, intelligence agencies and security actors to access some of this data, but that at the same time kind of produces vulnerabilities, right? Produces vulnerabilities in the systems that we use. And I think that's an important element that critical security studies has emphasized, right? About how this drive for security simultaneously produces insecurity, right? So that's another, I think, element in how we deal with the systems. So it doesn't mean that we can stop, ransomware, but we need to look at the conditions, right? Both in terms of the infrastructures, in terms of outdated, obsolescent infrastructure that has not been invested in, as well as interventions by the intelligence agencies themselves that render these infrastructures more vulnerable.
Let me move to the next question. The next question is that due to pandemic, the world has become more digitalized. Many countries that were not willing to spend on digital infrastructure are forced to do so. In this case, how do you look at the digital world in next 10 years and what new risks and challenges it might bring?
That's a really important question. And I think we have seen this really happening pretty much across the world, and it is ongoing. We have seen it also in the kind of huge profits that the big tech companies have made over this 1 year, more than 1 year of, of the pandemic around the world, and I'm thinking of the big tech companies. So, some of these debates kind of place a sort of zero sum, a sort of blackmail between health and again, questions of privacy, right? So in a sense, this question of health or kind of not, being in some way protected from the virus seems to be increasingly kind of dependent on digital technologies. And, that kind of requires giving up also on data, but giving up on some of the requests of privacy, or having some kind of form of privacy built in, but at the same time accepting all these digital technologies that produce more and more data that we know is given now to third party. And I think this kind of element of private actors is really important, right? The fact that, private actors have contracts and work with basically health providers, but also national governments to get access to the data and use this data. So I would like to suggest that what we need to challenge is this equation that we can have health and healthcare, or we can be protected. And again, we have the language of protection. We can be protected from the virus if only we have access and we accept and we kind of roll out these new digital technologies. And we've had that from the track and trace systems and so on. And that again kind of diverts attention from the kinds of health infrastructures that are needed, right? From basically having access to care, having oxygen, having the doctors having the care that's required, but also simple things where the people have actually the resources, right, to be able, for instance, to isolate as required by the app. And again, I'm speaking from the UK, and I'd be happy to hear about your experiences as well. But in the case of the UK, a lot of people could not afford to isolate, either for fear of losing their jobs, right, when their jobs could not be done from home, or simply for lack of, proper accommodation and so on. The world will only become, I think, more digitized. So this rolling of infrastructures, it is happening. But the question is whether we can use these digital technologies, right, not for the purposes of kind of more domination, kind of more, enlarging security, but to try to contest, to actually maybe join with some of the digital rights activists, to some of the people who are involved in this struggle, to contest these practices, right? And some of the uses of these technologies, for instance, is, rather than kind of using that to map cities, areas of crime and so on, could they be used, for instance, to map police violence, which are initiatives that are happening in Brazil and so on. So could they be used differently, right? But that would require actually, getting out of this framework, or challenges this framework in which these technologies are rolled out, either as security technologies or as promising protection, right? While basically extracting all this data and taking away this data, often from not just from individuals, right? From people, governments kind of extracting the data, and private companies extracting the data, but also the extraction of data from countries in the South to countries in the global North, right? And then I used for these types of analysis. I'm aware, I'll stop here because I'm aware that there are more questions, right? So I should.
Yes, Professor, I have lots of questions. I have around 17 in queue, so I'll try to merge them and skip some of them. Like there is a question: should cryptocurrency be considered illegal and banned, as hackers ask for payment in cryptocurrency like bitcoins, and it is almost impossible to track? Just to let you know that bitcoins is already banned in Nepal.
Oh, that's very interesting. So again, I think I won't say much about cryptocurrency because it is not the area that I work on, partly because I work on security issues. I do think that the way cryptocurrencies have been rolled out from as kind of technologies of trust, right? Again, from humanitarians to the use of in elections is very problematic. I don't think that this idea of trust in technology, where kind of the human becomes untrustworthy, I don't think we should accept this. So I think, have issues with this discourse around cryptocurrencies and how it can be rolled out and how it is used today. But I would love to learn more about the reasons and how it was banned in Nepal, and if anyone wants to share anything. I mean, I'll shut up because I would like to go to more questions, but also acknowledge where I haven't done research and where I have done research. So I'd be happy to learn more from you about the banning of cryptocurrency.
Let me club two more questions, like how states are using machine learning and deep learning in prevention and prediction of behavior of enemy in order to maintain peace. It is less contested that technology has a big role in articulating interest in international relations. Also, data privacy is the greatest challenge. Isn't some countries would shape public perception? That is one question. Second is, it is said that artificial intelligence will have huge impact in our lives. So how it will impact next 5-10 years? And second, who is taking the lead in artificial intelligence?
Wow. Thank you. These are wide-ranging questions and really important questions. I'm not sure I will be able to unpack them or do justice to them. So, in terms of machine learning, there has been a recent report by the National Security Council on artificial intelligence. This is in the US, that argues that basically all areas of security, they look at all areas of security in the United States, should incorporate artificial intelligence, and that's kind of, this ranges again from the military to secret. They see a particularly important role for intelligence agencies. But one example, I think that's is the one that I hinted at in the talk, which is about drone warfare, right? And here is the question of the question kind of mentioned in the maintenance of peace, right? But of course, this use of drone warfare, this use of big data, digital data, and artificial intelligence are used in principle for the purposes of security and achieving peace. However, I would argue that in these cases they have actually opposite effects, and that's why I think we need to be very careful about how about these uses of data. And I think the reason I focus on it is that a lot of emphasis again in international relations has been on autonomous lethal weapons, which I think is really an important area where there is a lot of work. But I think it risks kind of leaving to the side these other areas where it's much more a kind of minute uses of data, uses that don't appear at first sight problematic, and we are used to kind of use. Lots of people kind of use modes of, I don't know, facial recognition to open their computers or phones or whatever not, and then it becomes accepted, right? And the kind of this extraction of data, and we don't know. There are also forms of opacity around the circulation of this data. What happens to it? And we could ask these questions about this data that, as I was suggesting, is being used today, right? The data that we are producing, being here together and discussing, we are producing a lot of other digital data that can be used. I think I'm trying to remember now the second question. Sorry. Pramod.
There was one question on
yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
First was artificial intelligence, other was like how state use machine learning and deep learning in prevention and prediction of behavior of enemy in order to maintain peace.
Yeah, so this was the example, that's basically that, for instance, drones would kind of collect all this data, and we had a debate around Project Maven again, where some of you might have seen this, when Google workers kind of walked out and wrote a petition basically arguing that Google should not be in the business of warfare, And what Project Maven did, it basically tried to use images from drones, like the video stream from drones, right, for the purposes of image recognition, right, use artificial intelligence with the idea that they can again better identify both objects and people. And as Google withdrew from the contract later on, we had, I think, Palantir stepping in, right? So another company kind of doing this type of work. So these are the kind of areas in which this is happening, but also, it's not just states, it's also humanitarian actors who are now trying to use predictive analytics and machine learning, most often by collaborating with technology companies, partly because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the experts, right, to do this kind of work, which creates a lot of opacity about what these technologies are, who understands them, who produces them, but also who implements them. And what happens when, a humanitarian actor or an international organization is implementing artificial intelligence in their practices, when they don't understand, they don't know what algorithms are used, they don't fully understand what models were used, how they were trained, right, and what effects this might have on the ground. And predictive analytics is not necessarily just anomaly detection. So predictive analytics is about kind of finding clusters, right, and finding areas of intervention, so that resources, as in the case of predictive policing, right, so that resources can be kind of targeted to particular areas. But when you don't understand and you don't know enough about these models, which might have been created somewhere else, I think this is really problematic politically. So not simple questions, but questions about where these technologies are produced, who's using them, who kind of has access, right? And how they're rendered less opaque, but also what kind of forms of accountability. I mean, the case of Zaidan to me is really important because, who is kind of going to be responsible and who can be held accountable for these actions. And I think when it comes to these technologies, as you've seen, that are so dispersed because they work, with data from many places, they work with algorithms that are developed by somewhere else, but I can end up killing people rather than bringing peace. How do we think about accountability? What are the fora of accountability, both kind of nationally, but also internationally?
Since you have lots of questions, let me try to plow a few questions and you can try to answer some of them. Like there are lots, because these are technical questions. Like nowadays, organizations are coming with BYOD, which is bring your own device concept. What all security best practices need to follow in some cases? Because I think there are lots of people who are in technical field who have joined to the webinar. Similarly, there's another question on in dark web. We see all kind of illegal activities happening. Activities like dark purchase of weapons, child pornography, sale of credit card numbers, and many more. How can we combat these kind of illegal activities happening on dark web? Third is, how do we perceive future development in area of application and software security, which I think is a very technical question. Another is, how far are our personal information in this digital age? I mean, how safe are our personal information in this digital age? Is it not that anyone who stores our data in the server misuses it? So how safe is it for us to use social media? These are some of the questions which you might like to address together.
Okay. Can I start with our personal information? Because I think there's been a lot of emphasis on privacy, and some of the social media companies are actually promising more privacy than others. We have seen also kind of some of the changes in how social media companies like Facebook operate. But I want to give a rather brief answer to that, to actually say our personal data is not safe on social media, right? And this is partly because the model of the social media companies is to use our personal data and to use it for the purposes of marketing, right? Again, to target ads. So of course, it's a different type of targeting. The AI report that I mentioned earlier, interestingly, tells us that national security tech will become, or ed tech will become national security tech, right? So it's basic, and this is an argument that I've been making as well, that national security is actually taking the models of these marketing companies, both the technologies, but also the models. So yeah, I think it is not safe. It is in the sense in which data about data, so particularly metadata, is actually used and sold, and it is extracted. So yeah, again, thinking about kind of other technologies, and some of you mentioned, I think, what are the other ways in which you can ensure security. But yeah, the kind of traditional social media companies, and again, and the social media, you might see, or you might, use other ones, but the ones that I've been using, I said at the same time they're not safe. Having said that, right, it's a question about how do we interact, right? What kind of forms of interactions do we have? There have been arguments, made about the need to actually have public digital platforms, right? So not private digital platforms, and also kind of think about whether the role of private platforms today has taken almost like a state-like function, right? A governing function. And you can think also again in the pandemic about the forms of interaction that have been possible, the kind of our reliance on digital infrastructures that have been private, but these infrastructures have been, playing roles very similar to those of the state. I want to say something, again, I won't be able to answer to everything, but I want to say something about the dark web. Because I think that when it comes to digital technologies, as in all spheres of life, we should be careful about kind of starting from the extreme case, right? And I'm going to give you another example of what I'm trying to say. So, of course, there will always be, criminal behavior and so on. But it's a question if we start from this extreme case and we expand it to the whole of kind of how security works, how digital technologies are dealt with, I think this is a problem. And the question is whether we need to start from the kind of the kind of everyday, and also separate, right, particular security danger, security threats, and kind of think about different types of actions. So the reason I want to give this example is because, again, one debate about the use of digital surveillance, the use of digital data when they are kind of when they play out, we always have this answer, or this example that kind of shifts from questions of terrorism, where we have very few examples where actually digital data was useful, or hardly any. And this, I think, this has come out in the European Court of Human Rights judgment that came out yesterday in the case of Big Brother Watch and a series of other NGOs against the UK, right? Where there isn't enough evidence to show that the uses of this data, and particularly digital surveillance, is actually effective, right, when it comes to terrorists. But then you always have the other example where it's about, child abuse, child pornography, and so on. And I think we need to kind of raise this question of course, these are practices that need to be dealt with. I mean, it's a question whether this should be considered as security practices, and to me, they shouldn't be put in the same kind of under the same umbrella, if you want, as terrorism. And there is a question of which practices then, right? What is most effective in dealing with this, right? But I think starting from the dark web and kind of using it to deal with digital technologies, to deal with all the internet is problematic, right? So I'll say we need to start from this kind of mundane everyday practices, but also kind of attend to the specificity of all these issues, right? Rather than kind of starting all the time from the threat, and particularly the threat to the children, that is kind of, as a way to deal with all digital technologies.
Prof, Aradau, there are still 7 to 8 questions, but we don't have time, so maybe we can have another discussion in future. Let me formally propose a vote of thanks to you. We are really thankful once again for your wonderful discussion. It was really enlightening. We have learned a lot. I, on behalf of NICE and all our participants, would like to thank you for your time and lecture today. We hope to see you in real in Kathmandu or elsewhere. We'd also like to thank all our participants for the wonderful question. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. And I was wondering what I could save the questions, maybe the ones that I haven't had a chance to answer. And if anyone would like to follow up, or I would also be happy to share, any of the published work. But if you'd like to follow up with me, or if I misunderstood, I haven't had the chance due to time to answer your question, please feel free to get in touch, and I'll do my best to answer. And thank you again to NICE, and thank you for the invitation, and for all the kind of wide-ranging and difficult questions, which I think is bringing back again how important these issues of digital technologies are today.